Hello, everybody. My name is Jacek Bartosiak. Welcome to Strategy and Future. And today we have a distinguished guest, a special one, Mick Ryan, a retired Major General of Australian Army and a major strategist, frequently commenting on what's going on in Ukraine and the battlefields on the Dnieper River. Hi, sir. How are you?
I'm very good. Thank you for inviting me to speak with you today.
Yeah, that's really a privilege to talk to you, and I want to really exploit it. Since we agreed to talk about the evolution of the battlefield, what the war in Ukraine shows us all in terms where we're going, what wins, what is defeated at the battlefield, and what conclusions we might draw from those lessons going forward into the future, even to the near future. So, what is your general? Let's start with some sort of a general assessment of yours. What a few, what are a few issues that you would like to raise right at the outset of such a conversation, Nick?
Yeah, well, thank you. I guess a couple of things. Firstly, that support for Ukraine remains strong in Western capitals. There's a lot of focus on one part of the southern battlefield, but the reality is this is just one campaign of many that Ukraine is undertaking on the ground, in the air, at sea, in cyberspace, and in the information domain. And whilst, as President Zelensky has noted, progress has not been as quick as many would like, this is just one of many medium and long term undertakings that Ukraine has ongoing at the moment. But back to the original point, I still see support being very strong for Ukraine. I mean, I saw a poll here in Australia just recently where 75% of Australians support either the current support or increasing it for Ukraine, and that's from the other side of the world. So, I think in Europe it's generally along the same lines. You certainly have a more compelling, direct, and proximate interest to what's going on there. But at this point in time, support for Ukraine appears to be holding up, and that's a good thing.
Okay, so right at the outset, you're trying to underline the constant support from the West, which of course is the foundation of Ukrainians still fighting in this war, stirring up resistance just from the beginning until now, in terms of logistics, supply, money, aid, and of course equipment. What else would you draw our attention to in terms of the how Ukraine is standing and what sort of the picture looks like at the moment?
Well, clearly, neither Ukraine nor Russia is willing to step back from this fight. I mean, both have the will and the resources and the endurance to fight this war for some time to come. There is, I think, no prospect of this war being over in this calendar year, as some would hope. I think it will at least continue into next year, if not longer than that. So I think we all need to be prepared for a longer conflict. That is nothing new in the Western tradition. I mean, we've fought long wars before. For goodness sake, we were in Afghanistan for 20 years. So, this notion that Western publics lack patience, I think, should be tested with evidence when they see a compelling purpose to provide long term support. I think there is one there for Ukraine. And whilst you may see that support slip from very high levels to medium to high levels, I still think that support is there. At the end of the day, no nation can defend itself alone. It's a fantasy to think that any nation today, even the United States, could undertake something like this by itself. My country relies heavily on partners, including the United States and others, and every country in Europe depends on its friends, partners, and allies for its defence. Ukraine is no different there, and we're just going to have to commit to that defence, as NATO has done in the most recent Vilnius summit, even though that promise didn't go as far as many would like. I think that collective defence rationale in Europe has been reinforced by this war. And indeed, many, in particular Poland, are really investing in their defence to ensure that whether Ukraine wins or loses, they're able to contribute to their own defence and that of their friends. I guess I'd finish by saying, win or lose, Russia is going to be a dangerous country after this war. There is no prospect of Russia being a less dangerous nation after this war. It will be more dangerous whether it wins or loses, and we all need to be prepared for that.
Mm-hmm. I will get back to what we think at Strategy and Future about the timelines, and I will confront my timelines with your views. But before we do it, I have a few other questions so that we sort of create a multiple domains of conversation, so that
sure.
in order to make it more picturesque, so to speak, and interesting for our audience. And you have mentioned right now that both sides have resources to continue the war. So let's get more granular. What do you think the evidence suggests about the resources that Russia brings to the table and their resolve to continue this war? There are conflicting views here in Poland about it, honestly speaking. So first of all, it seems that the Russian military, of course, have not proceeded properly on the battlefield. They have lost a lot of equipment. But at the same time, there are reports, and of course, we can see from the equipment that sometimes it's old. They are trying to restore old equipment into the battlefield. But at the same time, their factories are working. They have reduced, but still some growth in the economy. They have oil, they have gas, they have all metals needed for manufacturing, and they have partners in Asia. So let me put it that way. What is your long view in terms of the Russian resources, before I ask you about the Western resources, especially in ammo and resolve? It's also a resource. So what do you think? What would you make of the Russian gearing up for a long war?
Yeah, certainly they have several key resources that will help them fight a long war. First is their economy. Even though about a third of the world has sanctions against Russia, 2/3 of the world don't. So they're by no means economically isolated, and by no means without sources of revenue when it comes to generating income that they can use to fund this war and other elements of the government. It may not be the same level that it received before this war, but it's still trading with many countries, including India, including China. So that economic resource is not going to go away anytime soon. It has a large population. I mean, it has a population of roughly 140 million people. By no means are they fully mobilized, not even close to that. And yes, whilst Russia, like many Western nations, has a smaller proportion of its 18 to 35-year-old population that are fit for military service, it just depends on how you classify fit for military service. So, the Russians certainly have the people to be able to continue this war. And by the way, they're not mobilizing women, they're only mobilizing men. So that is a large resource that's yet to be tapped. And I think diplomatically, they still have many countries around the world that are neutral in this conflict, that don't want to play any role in it and aren't interested in participating in any kind of sanctions regime against Russia. Finally, they certainly have the will. I mean, Putin has sold this to the Russian people as a civilizational battle. But NATO and the West are trying to extinguish Russian history and culture, and that this is all about NATO and most recently Ukraine attacking Russia. Now, this is a fanciful myth, as we know, but Putin has been on this narrative about Russia, its history, and the threat from the West for some time. And if you read others who've studied Russian history and strategy, this sense of vulnerability is an integral part of Russian strategic culture, and Putin's borrowing heavily from that as well. So, all these things add up to a nation that can continue this fight for some time to come, unfortunately.
Yeah, I fully concur. The Russians have had a long history of even, keeping up with the conflict, trying to adjust, even suffering heavy losses at the beginning. And I'm not talking even about the Second World War or the First World War, things that are, relatively fresh in our memories, but also Napoleonic wars and other wars they had, even the Great Northern War in the 18th century that set the stage for their becoming a major great power in Europe. So they know it. They, in the corridors of the Kremlin, the corridors of their foreign ministry and their MOD, they know it. They have patience. The question is whether they have resources, and it's still, debatable in that respect. Yes, it's especially important to make for Poland because we, and here I will spill the beans a bit. We are afraid here that there will be some sort of a truce or some sort of stalemate between Ukraine and even enforced by the West because of the low ammo storages and other political factors like U.S. elections. Given the fact that there might be not evident offensive gains, so it will be very difficult to sell to the public to continue the effort, and there will be some sort of a truce, which for the Russians will be only a передышка, an operational pause. And after 2 years, 3 years, whatever, there will be a repetition of the conflict, this time involving Poland as well, as a center of gravity of the NATO eastern flank, the main operational base from which Ukrainians, the supplies are being delivered to Ukraine. And in the meantime, we'll have a hybrid warfare with, Wagner and other people trying to inflict damage on Poland. So we're getting ready for that, Nick. And even without looking in detail at what's going on in Ukraine, we don't believe that Russians will come to terms with the fact that they didn't take Kiev, that they didn't achieve the political dominance over Ukraine. Plus, of course, and that's just my next question, we are observing all, if any, signs of Ukraine imploding, inner conflict, anything that would suggest that the Ukraine military might, and their economy might not last. So what do you think about that? What are the Ukrainian prospects for political cohesion, for military cohesion, in view of the, sort of lost territories and apparent lack of capability to regain them, and lack of money? What do you think?
No, I think you raised some very good points there. I mean, Ukraine, when it got its and voted for its independence in 1991, it was a pretty grim place for a while. People, there was pretty hard times for the vast majority of Ukrainians. Now, they weren't fighting for their lives like they are now, but, they had to go through some pretty tough economic and social times in the 1990s. So they're not strangers to privations, but the economic issue is an important one. I mean, part of Russia's strategy is economic warfare against Ukraine. It's in their military doctrine. I mean, this isn't any great mystery. It's part of how they operate, whether it's military operations or high-level hybrid operations. Taking this southern part of Ukraine was an important part of that. It's captured most of Ukraine's seaports. It's captured large areas of arable land, mines, and steel manufacturing, fertilizer production, which are very significant parts of Ukraine's capacity to generate export revenue. I mean, it's down by 40 to 50% since the beginning of the war. This is not an accident of the war. This is very deliberate by Russia to strangle Ukraine and deny it the basis for sovereign governance. So taking back the South really is a very, very important part of Ukraine's war plans to re-establish its economy. But until that time, I mean, the EU, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the United States have recognised this economic challenge posed by the drastic reduction in Ukrainian GDP and the cost of actually waging a war, paying soldiers, paying civil servants, paying firefighters and ambulance people. This is a cost that the West appears to be absorbing in part. Certainly the EU and IMF and World Bank and other European organisations are stepping up to do that. Now, whether that will entirely fill the gap or not, I'm not privy to. That would be something that the Ukrainian government talks about with senior leaders in the West. But we do kind of overlook the economic dimensions of this war sometimes because a lot of people are fascinated by the military dimensions. Another element, I think, of the economic bit is reconstruction. I mean, the costs of reconstruction are already been placed at around $800 billion US dollars, and that will continue to go up. It's something the Ukrainians have already started. They don't want to wait to the end of the war to rebuild hospitals, rebuild social services. People need them now. They won't wait years for them. So these all play into the economic dimension. And then I think the other bit too is the remnants of war issue that will play a significant social and economic role in the future of Ukraine. Something like 15% of the country is contaminated with remnants of war, whether it's unexploded ordnance, mines, or these kind of things. Mm-hmm. Now, these will all play into the determining Ukraine's economic potential in the future. And it's going to take some pretty clever thinking and some pretty smart policy and some discipline from the Ukrainian government with their friends in Europe and beyond to pull this off over the medium and long term.
Yeah, that is, of course, true. But now, since we have outlined the general picture of the war efforts on both sides, let's maybe dive, if you don't mind, into particular questions regarding the military operations, both past and contemporary, in Ukraine that I'd like to ask to you. First of all, what happened? What do you think, as a general, what happened that the Russians didn't seize Kiev, in terms operational terms? If you just could give me your answer, because it's still the question is still in the air. Yeah. And why then didn't manage to seize Kiev?
Well, I think there's a few contributing factors. First was their intelligence, their strategic intelligence about the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian people was wrong, like it was before the 2014 war. I mean, because of the intelligence, Putin and others assumed that the Ukrainian government would fold and run after a bit of pressure from a military campaign, that the Ukrainian military was the one they'd faced in 2014, not one that had spent 8 years reforming itself with NATO. So, they made these assumptions, and because of these strategic assumptions about the Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian military, and by the way, the willingness of NATO and Europe to assist Ukraine, they thought once again, based on 2014, it would be pretty limited. They structured their military campaign in a certain way, and that really was about an administrative move into Kiev and other major centres, and then quickly transition into an occupying force. Now, when you build a campaign around those kind of assumptions, you probably underdo things like logistics, you underdo things like where you put your artillery, you underdo things like telling your soldiers exactly what they're going to be doing. And I think this played out in the first 48 hours. That once that coup de main operation at Hostomel Airport didn't work out, the entire Russian plan became unravelled in the north and the northeast, and they had to kind of adapt on the go from an administrative operation to a combat operation. And the Ukrainians were able to exploit that period when the Russians were in organisational shock and in that transition period. And I think that largely determined the failure of the Russian campaign in the north. Now, in the south, it was a very different story, of course. they were able to move from areas in Crimea with good logistics. And, there's still investigations ongoing in the Ukrainian government about why they moved so quickly, but they were able to move and take over Kherson and Zaporizhia very quickly indeed. So, they're not total idiots. As General Syrskyi said recently, the Russians aren't idiots. They're not. They are able to learn. They have demonstrated learning, but their learning and adaptation hasn't been of the same quality and speed as the Ukrainians has in this war.
Mm-hmm. And what happened also in the same vein? It seemed here in Poland, at least, at the beginning of this war, it seemed reasonable for the Russians to try to cut off the Western supply lines going through Lviv and Western Ukraine. But even by the move from Belarus, this country was used anyway in attack against Kiev. So what do you think? What happened that the Russians didn't make this move? That was the main fear here in Poland. And still it didn't materialize, that they didn't cut off the Western Ukraine from the rest of the country. What happened? What do you think?
No, I think that's a really good question. I mean, if you had to pick the top three mysteries from this war, that would probably be right up the top there. The Russians did stage through Belarus. They would only have had to stage, 100 or 200 kilometres further to the west to insert themselves between Kiev and Lviv, and that would have made Ukrainian operations extraordinarily difficult. I'm not sure why they didn't do that, but I think once again, because they assumed Ukraine would fall pretty quickly, they probably didn't think they had to do it. I'm sure in their planning they must have at least wargamed this option or at least discussed it. And it was probably discounted because they didn't think they'd be fighting a combat operation. And I think, too, Putin assumed, just like with Crimea in 2014, with Georgia, with Chechnya twice, and with Syria, the West would not decisively intervene. And if you think about it, that probably wasn't a bad assumption, because for the last 20 years, the West has kind of let Russia get away with murder on multiple occasions. On this occasion, for a range of reasons, including very good strategic information operations and leadership from President Zelensky, the West decided that it was going to decisively intervene, and the Russian strategic plan came tumbling down.
Mm-hmm. And another question along those lines. The Americans stepped up support alongside with the Poles and the British right at the beginning. And, we were all afraid of the escalation management in terms of both vertical, nuclear, and horizontal in terms of, just the war, also embracing NATO countries. But still, Americans were doing a pretty fine job in escalation containment, what we call the helping by and learning by doing. So they were learning how to help Ukrainians by delivering, even sometimes to the teaspoon quantities of weaponry. I understand in a way so that the Russians are not in fear and are not pushed into escalation. Or it seems very difficult in the thermonuclear age to handle it, all close to the Russian heartland, right? And still winning the war. What happened? What do you think? That the Russians accepted this sort of kind of war because they might have not. They might have expanded operations even by hybrid. They might have done quite a lot of other aggressive things, and still they have accepted, even when they were losing this kind of escalation, rank, sort of this level of escalation. They were losing within this frame, and they might have been tempted to escalate further, and they didn't. This question is particularly important if you let me just explain and justify why I'm asking it to the strategist, because in order for the Russians to lose, we need to convince them, the Americans have to convince them that they need to accept the defeat within the agreed set of rules of escalation, which sounds very difficult. What do you think, Mick?
I think you're on the money. I mean, only one country can determine whether Russia loses, and that's Russia at the end of the day. Ukraine will obviously fight to its dying breath to make that happen, but at the end of the day, the Russians have to accept they've lost, and hopefully it's within that escalation box that's been established right now. I think when it comes to nuclear deterrence, both sides probably believe they've been successful. I think the Russians believe they've been successful in deterring NATO from more decisively intervening. There's no boots on the ground. There isn't a no-fly zone over Ukraine provided by NATO. And certain weapon systems have not yet been provided. So Russian nuclear deterrence, they would believe they've been successful, and I think that's probably right. But at the same time, the US nuclear umbrella that is provided for NATO has also, I think, worked. It has deterred Russia from this horizontal escalation about looking at other geography beyond Ukraine for this war. It has prevented Russia doing anything with its nuclear weapons other than talking about them. There's no evidence that they've made any of the preparations for the use of these weapons. So, I think this is a great case study of nuclear deterrence actually working. Restricting it to a conventional fight, restricting it geographically. Unfortunately, it hasn't restricted the awful brutality that we've seen out of the Russians in destroying Ukrainian cities, cultural sites, and treating Ukrainian citizens with the most awful, murderous contempt. So, nuclear deterrence works to a certain level, but when it comes to conventional operations, once you're in that box, the Russians appear to have decided, okay, we've been deterred from doing stuff beyond Ukraine, but we're going to do whatever we want in Ukraine, and no one's going to stop us, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Of course, that brings me to a new set of questions that maybe I will ask later in terms of the sort of this temptation that we might have a limited war in the era of thermonuclear weaponry, but still we can manage and mitigate the risk of thermonuclear war and other limited wars that we might have, like with China, for example. Given that there are the multiplicity of domains, trade domain, technology domains, so they're all domains, and we can sort of think that we might handle them without escalation, and that would take us to a completely different dimension of even a scalable world war, so to speak, if we are talking about great power competition in Eurasia. So I'm right now. We are in the midst of thinking about it. Strategy and future. That's why I ask this question openly. But let me get back to the battlefield in Ukraine. There is a major discussion in different quarters about the difficulty of offensive moves on the fronts. Both, the Russians demonstrated that. If they meet a fierce resistance from the Ukrainians, it's difficult to overcome the modern defense systems. Yeah, the tanks, the mass can be defeated by precision, by C2, by proper situational awareness. So situational awareness combined with long-range fires or with cheap anti-tank weaponry can defeat mass. Mass is becoming a problem. You concentrate, you are seen, you can be fired upon, sort of, right? So are we really seeing if there are fighting powers, the peers on the battlefield, symmetrical battlefield? Are we slowly but steadily moving away from the Napoleonic concept of always concentration of mass in attack, because this becomes vulnerable, in fact, and we need to find another way of doing the offensive movements?
Well, I'd say first that ever since the beginning of the first industrial revolution, there has been this trend of a emptying battlefield. I mean, battlefield densities have dropped over the last 200 years or so because of the ability to mass produce weapons, mass produce munitions, and better achieve situational awareness and share that. Now, that's been a 200-year trend. Generally, that has been responded to with dispersion. So there's a lethality dispersion relationship that Trevor Dupuy actually graphed in his great book on weapons and war. I'd recommend that to your listeners. And I think we're continuing to see that play out. I mean, the really important trends that I think we're seeing play out in this war, first one is what I call the signature battle. Everything has a signature, whether it's a human, whether it's a vehicle, whether it's a brigade. It's just now that with what I call this meshed civil military sensor network, signatures are simpler to detect than they ever have been. Now, there's a problem then with a lot of noise and, trying to find the signal in the noise. But the signature battle is a very important one, and it's only more important now. So I think that's an important trend. I think a second important one, which is related, is human-machine teaming. It's not just about UAVs, it's about humans have adopted autonomous and semi-autonomous and remotely controlled aerial and ground vehicles, and then integrated them into their recon, surveillance, fires framework in a way that is closing the detection to destruction gap. When I was a Combined Arms Brigade commander, you knew you had about 10 minutes once you were detected to leave. Now you have about 1 to 2.
Mm-hmm.
That
The OODA
fundamentally...
loop. The OODA loop is becoming much shorter, and who is faster, the OODA loop is winning.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
But that has a whole range of implications for force design, for tactics, for organisation, both deliberate and hasty battle grouping, that we haven't really come to grips with very well. I mean, we see this conversation play out, well, the Ukrainians aren't doing combined arms very well. It's like, well, maybe the combined arms that we've all been taught and been learning for the last 40 years isn't fit for purpose anymore. And maybe NATO needs a program to be looking at combined arms for the 21st century and developing that and helping Ukraine that way rather than trying to teach them combined arms for the 20th century. I think the conduct of combined arms breaching operations is a great example of old doctrine and old technologies being forced on the Ukrainians. And when it doesn't work, we're going, well, they didn't do it properly.
Very good point. Very good point.
I just don't think that's fair. I think that the battlefield has changed since the last time Europeans fought combined arms warfare, and we haven't caught up with the doctrinal, with the tactical and the organisational elements to be effective on that modern battlefield. I think, too, that there's a trend in digital battle command now that is irreversible and that is no longer discretionary. If you're an army who thinks you can operate with paper maps and analogue radios, you are going to lose. And I state that categorically, you will not win. If you don't have the connectivity that connects the lowest levels to a range of information, fires, logistics, and personnel services, you just can't move quickly. And most importantly, you can't learn and adapt your tactics, your organisations, your dispositions in a way that will allow you to survive and succeed on the modern battlefield. So, I mean, these are just a couple of the trends we're seeing. I do think mass is still important, but it's not our grandfather's mass. It's a new kind of mass that's generated partially by armoured vehicles and soldiers, but also partially by autonomous systems and partially by massed influence operations. So I think mass still matters, but it's a different kind of mass than we saw in, say, preparing for the Second World War and these kind of things. The Second World War is an important learning and historical opportunity, but the world has changed since then, and we need to understand what's changed so we can change our doctrine, our training, our leadership models, our organisation and our strategic logistic support models.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point that I'll try to refer in the debate in Poland as well later, about the fact that the Ukrainians were training according to the NATO standards and breaching operations, and maybe simply they might be obsolete or be on the brink
Yep.
of obsolescence. And that's a matter of fact. This is my feeling as well. Of course, it has to be tested in some evidence on the battlefield. But that's a very good point. That's a very good point and a sobering one, by the way, just for some. Like for Polish military modernization, we should think twice how to do breaching if we need to in the future. So, very good point. Thank you very much. And
well, you're fortunate that you have a very clever chief of defence and vice chief. I know them both, and they're the kind of leaders and soldiers who do think about these kind of things. And given you have a very proximate strategic problem there with the Russians, maybe we should be looking to Poland to how you solve these problems.
Yeah, I agree. And along those the same lines, and since we started discussing the evolution of the battlefield, what do you think about the if you have a situational awareness, you have all those systems, OODA loop, all those sensors, a lot of them, both civilian and military, you never know whether now it's military or civilian anyway. What is the concept of flanks? And it has always been with us that you don't want to be outflanked by maneuver. So how does this change in terms of organization of the troops and the front line? What does the front line look like these days in that context? And how deep is the operational space so that, for example, if you rotate platoons or companies into the rear so that they have 2 days of rest or 3 days of rest, how deep they need to be moved so that they are far away from drone UAVs and other assets that can really make them tired. So what could you? It's rarely in the debate, this subject, and I really like to know your opinion about it.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, what does the deep close rear fight look like in the 21st century? I think that's a pretty neat way of thinking about battlefield geometry. And you can apply it regardless of geography, as long as the Marines used to say, there was doctrine sound, not doctrine bound. And I think if you look at that, you ask that question about Ukraine, and then you ask that question about Taiwan, or you ask that question about the Baltic states, it will look a bit different each time. Similar concepts, but you're still going to have that construct. I think depth is going to be different, but longer than it has been historically. The deep fight, and your rear fight is going to extend all the way back to your population. Now, that's nothing new, I don't think, anymore. I think that the first time that really happened was in the first Crimean War, when the British put in a telegraph which could send messages to London overnight, and then they started getting direction back overnight from politicians. So that rear battle is something that has been going on for 170 years or so now, and I don't see that really changing. I mean, one of your key flanks isn't physical; it's support by your own population, right? That's an important flank to make sure it is secure for a military organisation. And you do that in peacetime by making sure that you're a military that reflects your society and that is joined up to it, doesn't set itself apart like some do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, also speaking about different domains of the battlefield, of course, we all heard before about the information domain. We also, when we read news from the Second World War, information domain was also an important factor. Churchill's speeches, Hitler's speeches, newspapers in occupied Europe talking Nazi propaganda, etc. But still, here in this symmetrical battlefield that we saw, especially in the opening months of the war, the Ukrainians managed to shape the battlefield and the perception of the battlefield, not only the morale, but also perception of the Western societies, of the Russian troops, of the Ukrainian troops, by fighting a proper war in information domain. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it was one campaign of many that they had to fight, but it was a really vital one. I mean, right from the get-go, the Ukrainians settled on a strategy of investing in their strategic influence. I think there are two important parts of it. One is internal, sustaining Ukrainian unity, which is an important part of their overall war strategy. And then the second element was building and sustaining support from the West. And, Zelensky has been a critical part of that. I don't need ammunition. Sorry, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition. I mean, electrified many leaders and citizens around the world. And it's a cause that's been taken up not just by Ukrainians, but many citizen influencers around the world as well. I mean, the Ukrainians get a lot of help from people in all kinds of countries, from all kinds of backgrounds, who have decided that the information war is worth their time to invest in, that Ukraine is worthy of support. And we see things like the North Atlantic Fellow Organization, for example, arise that combats Russian misinformation. So I think it's a crucial part of Ukrainian strategy. It's an integral part of what I would now call the Ukrainian way of war. And it's, something that they've had to carefully manage, but also learn and adapt as the world keeps changing over the last 18 months or so. And there's a lot, I think, that we can all learn from it. I mean, we can't copy it because Ukrainian culture is unique, just like Polish culture is unique or Australian culture is unique. But there are themes and elements of what the Ukrainians have done that I think we can all learn from.
Mm. So, what do you think? It's I'm not asking what's going to happen on the front now, but what do you think might be the sort of the directions that the Ukrainian general staff will make? Whether this will be a long-range fires to attrit the operational depth and the logistics of the Russian military, or are you expecting offensive maneuvers to regain control? Of course, there are political pressures, probably pressures upon the Ukrainian commanders. So, what do you think? What can we see unfolding?
Yeah, I think it's worth stating up front that no senior military commander is ever free from the politics of their country, whether it's a democracy or authoritarian regime. Military operations only exist to serve policy and politics. So, there will be pressure. There has been pressure. There will continue to be pressure on military commanders. Okay, let's put that to the side. I think what the Ukrainians did originally was, they tried to do a Kharkiv, a quick breakthrough. I mean, Kharkiv still took about a week of hard fighting for them to penetrate the Russian defences, and I think they hoped they might be able to achieve that. It became clear that the Surovikin line was extraordinarily dense and manned well and covered with observation and fires in a way that I don't think any country would be well prepared to penetrate. So they've adapted in the south, and I think, I've termed it really as the bite and hold strategy the Brits started using on the Western Front from about 1917, and it worked. But it's slow, it's gradual, and you have to cause attrition to the enemy in both the close fight as well as the deep battle, and that's this attrition of artillery, logistics, headquarters, transportation nodes, concurrently, to gradually build pressure on the Russian system. And hopefully, through the combination of physical combat, the deep fires, the impact on Russian morale, the degradation of their command and control, the attrition of reserves to respond to penetrations, we'll see the Russians culminate before the Ukrainians do. And at the end of the day, that's the real thing in all of their campaigns. You hope that your adversary culminates before you do. Um, and, I think there is some anecdotal evidence that the Russians are under significant pressure in the south, um, although not enough that they're moving significant forces from the Hunsk, from their offensive there at the moment. So this is going to be going on for a while yet, and I think the Ukrainians are trying to slowly ratchet up the pressure on the Russians without having to sacrifice too many of this generation of young men and women to achieve it.
Yeah, yeah, good point. Moving away from the European theater, moving closer to Australia and the Western Pacific, Mick. So, what do you make out of all those voices signaling concern about incoming events in 2024 after Taiwanese elections and U.S. elections? There might be a sort of a clash between U.S. and China and the Western Pacific. And these are serious people talking openly about it. Probably you're very much sure about it. You very much well aware about it, living in Australia. We've been watching at Strategy&Future those events with equal importance. And those events might be even more important for the world than war in Ukraine. So what do you make out of this?
It's a fascinating region. I'm privileged to live out here. I think that having my first undergraduate degree was in Asian studies, and I was an Indonesian linguist. I've travelled through Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, and Japan. Recently returned from Taiwan. It is a very dynamic region, but it is not Europe. It is not a region where military alliances like NATO are ever going to exist, I don't think. There's a tradition of kind of staying out of your neighbour's business. And the Chinese have been using that cultural kind of posture to deal one-on-one with countries as the big dog. What's happened, though, in that relationship that Chinese has been seeking to build, it's been a bully. It's been using this wolf warrior diplomacy, and it has really backfired on them. And a lot of countries have been saying to America, hey, we need you here. And I think, the great indicator of Chinese failure is when Vietnam, kind of said to America, we welcome your ship visits. We'd really like you to remain engaged in this region. Now, this is a country that fought a decade-long war against the United States, lost at least 1 million of its young, lost an entire generation in that war. And even it is looked at the situation and go, we think the Americans should be in this region. So I guess that, that's the grand strategy, and the Americans are certainly spending a lot of time and money investing in the region, economically, diplomatically, militarily, although probably needs more economics and less military. But 2024 is a really important year. You have the current president of Taiwan, President Tsai, will be stepping down. She can't stand again. And her party and the KMT will fight it out as normal. I think her party is more likely to win, but you just never know. The Chinese would rather her party not win. And you're seeing in Taiwan, the new generation of people see themselves as Taiwanese, not transplanted Chinese. And they're more likely to fight for their independence than people expect. I was up there 2 months ago and I asked them, I said, what's the biggest lesson you've taken away from Ukraine? And, this was from people like ministerial level and deputy ministers. They said the biggest lesson is that if you don't help yourself first, no one's going to help you. So they have, looked at their defence strategy. They've looked at the overall defence concept, which was developed by Admiral Lee Semin in 2017. They've looked at their war stocks. They've looked at national service, all these things, their national resilience, say, hey, we really have to sort ourselves out if we expect others to help us. It's kind of like Poland's been doing, right, with this massive defence investment and expansion of military capability and size. It's like we need to help ourselves first, and then hopefully others will help us. The Taiwanese are probably a little further behind than Poland is, but they've realised that they probably need to step up across a range of things in the defence of their country. The Japanese are the same; they've just doubled their defence budget. Very impressive what they're doing. In fact, I was watching an aircraft carrier off my balcony come up the bay yesterday. This is a very capable and large and technologically advanced nation with a very capable military that is now operating in a way that 20 years ago was unthinkable in its engagement with other countries and sharing of its capabilities. So you've seen a very significant shift in this region in the last decade. I think the Chinese, given the almost exclusive decision-making authority of President Xi, are very capable of miscalculating the will of countries like Japan, Australia, and the United States. I desperately hope that they don't, because if they do start something over Taiwan, I think it will be very difficult to avoid horizontal escalation in this region. And that would be catastrophic, not just for the region, but I think for the global economy.
Cool. Okay, let's maybe end here, Mick. We touched just gently upon the Pacific theater. Maybe we have a chance to talk about it in the future.
Certainly.
I really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you very much for your time and your knowledge that you have shared with our audience. Our guest today was Major General retired Mick Ryan from Australia, a great strategist that I have been watching on Twitter. His commentaries on war in Ukraine. Thank you very much again, sir.
Thank you, and I look forward to coming back to Poland again soon.
Cool. And please, all of us, stay with us for more podcasts. Take care.